The rain waited. That in itself was considered something of a mercy. Flaxmere, which called itself a market town with a firmness that suggested recent doubt, had arranged its annual evening of gentle voices beneath the assumption of dry skies and lightly curious attendance. The event was held in the lower assembly room of the town hall, a chamber whose acoustics favoured both whispering and disapproval. A row of folding chairs, metal, optimistic, and faintly treacherous, had been set in neat ranks, and the stage was decorated with 3 potted ferns that had been borrowed from the Women's Guild and already missed. By 7:30, the audience had assembled in its usual configuration. The town's determined cultural duty-doers in the first 2 rows, the mildly curious in the middle, and those who had come purely to observe the audience rather than the performers at the back. At precisely 34 seconds past the half hour, Miss Agatha Plume stepped forward. She was a thin woman, of an age that resisted inquiry, and possessed of a voice that in happier circumstances might have been used to train spaniels. She wore a lavender cardigan that had not asked to be present, and had been holding a single sheet of paper with both hands, as though it might escape. The chairman of the evening, Mr. Lionel Braithwaite, whose tie-knot suggested internal conflict, smiled at her with municipal kindness and sat down with relief. Miss Plume cleared her throat. There is a particular silence that municipal rooms acquire just before something mildly disastrous occurs. It is not loud, it is not theatrical, it is the sound of lungs waiting to disapprove, Miss Plume began. Sometimes, she said very clearly, it is not the things people do that should frighten us. She paused, and several people shifted, already thinking this promising. But the things they make us forget. A small cough surfaced in the second row. This was Mrs. Delaney, who made a modest hobby of coughing at critical moments. Miss Plume continued, "There are houses in this town." The word houses carried more weight than it strictly deserved. That have heard more truth than the people who live inside them. A chair creaked. Someone, quite unfairly, dropped a program. She lowered her paper slightly, and for the first time looked directly at the audience, which is always a mistake. "Last winter, I heard a voice in the rain," she said, "and it did not belong to the wind." There was a pause so complete that the ceiling seemed to reconsider itself. Outside, beyond the frosted windows, the sky shifted its colour from hesitant grey to something more decisive. Miss Plume took a breath. "I think she tried to tell me." The first drop of rain struck the glass. It sounded like a small, hard certainty. She did not finish the sentence, not because of theatrics, not because of timing, simply because the room in its own way refused to let her. There was a sound, a peculiar sound, from the back of the hall, the scrape of a chair, a sharp intake of breath, and then a noise like a book dropped onto a stone floor. Miss Plume flinched backwards as though struck by emotion, though it was unclear whose emotion she had in mind. Beyond the windows, the sky lost patience. Rain began. It did not arrive politely. It did not test the drains. It struck the town with the enthusiasm of a long-suppressed opinion. Within seconds, the sound on the glass drowned the smaller noises. The uneasy shifting, the questions that had not yet found language, the quiet fear that now sat carefully on every shoulder. Miss Plume folded her paper very neatly and stepped away from the lectern, her mouth pressed into a line of private concern. Mr. Braithwaite rose too quickly and sat down again too slowly. "Well," he said, to no one in particular, and most atmospheric, no one laughed. The meeting ended 5 minutes early, which was reported later as a mark of solemn sensitivity. Chairs were folded with unnecessary precision. Coats were gathered. Polly Went, who ran the town's hair salon, lingered by the door to absorb the event properly, which meant watching faces. Outside, the rain had developed into something purposeful. The cobbles darkened like guilty thoughts. The gutters, long ignored, protested. At the top of the steps, Mrs. Delaney leaned towards Mr. Hobb, the ironmonger. "Did you hear what she nearly said?" she asked. "I heard what she meant," Mr. Hobb replied, which is always the more dangerous version. Across the square, the sign for the Draper's Arms swung slightly in the wind, its chains complaining with modest regularity. Down a quieter street, unseen by those who preferred to be seen, a figure paused beneath the narrow awning of a shuttered shop. The person wore a dark coat, held an umbrella they did not open, and watched the rain with a kind of private calculation. From an upstairs window, someone else, who did not wish to be associated with the town's cultural life at all, watched Miss Plume hurry away, her lavender cardigan already making faint concessions to the weather. In the lamp-lit quiet of the police station, Inspector Purbright had not yet heard any of this. He was, at that moment, engaged in the careful reconsideration of a biscuit, which he suspected had been overpraised. The storm, however, had already decided to include him. And somewhere, beneath the ordinary sounds of rain, a sentence lay unfinished, as quietly dangerous as a stone in a shoe. By morning, Flaxmere had decided what had happened. Not precisely, of course. Precision was thought vulgar in matters of collective imagination. But the shape of the thing had formed. Something improper had nearly been said, something worse had almost been heard, and something criminal had likely been meant. Rain lay across the streets in reflective sheets, allowing the town to admire its own concern from multiple angles. The gutters, overworked by sudden relevance, continued their low, argumentative chatter. At Mrs. Delaney's breakfast table, which faced the square with a dedication resembling moral duty, the incident had already acquired a middle, an emphasis, and a conclusion. She was about to name a house. Mrs. Delaney announced to her toaster with confidence. The toaster, which had been produced in Birmingham and trusted no one, disagreed by burning the bread. Across the way, at the Draper's Arms, Mr. Hobb was explaining to three men who had not asked that he had perceived a tone of accusation, he clarified, which relieved him of having to specify any detail. Polly Went had not slept well. She claimed this was due to the barometric pressure, but privately knew it was because she had seen the look on Miss Plume's face as she folded the paper. Polly's gifts were largely facial. You could tell she'd been listening to something not meant for her, she said to a customer who had asked only for a trim. The customer, a timid man from the post office, nodded weakly and silently hoped never to overhear anything at all. Behind neck curtains, which had achieved a soft conspiratorial flutter from the night's dampness, faces hovered like thoughtful ornaments. Women paused mid-dusting. Men stood too long with their tea going cold. Everyone remembered that last winter had, indeed, been unusually wet and possibly full of voices. The story improved as it moved. By 10 o'clock, Miss Plume had been seen late at night in the company of a figure in a long coat. By 10:30, the figure was carrying a parcel. By 11, the parcel had developed a sinister ticking quality. None of this had reached Miss Plume, who was at that time sitting in her kitchen eating toast with the stubborn dignity of a person who had almost become important by accident. Across from her, the empty chair at the small table sat with inappropriate calm. The town council office opened with a resigned sigh. Mr. Lionel Braithwaite arrived early so that he might be seen arriving early. He removed his hat, hung his coat, and sat at his desk to consider how best to appear helpful without becoming involved. The girl from the typing pool, a serious creature named Marjorie, whispered to the filing cabinets that it was about a woman, obviously, which the cabinets absorbed without comment. At the railway buffet, which served tea of philosophical weakness, the porters discussed the rain. "I came down sudden," said one. "I came down knowing," said another. A third suggested that rain which began at a dramatic moment could not possibly be free of meaning. Further down the platform, a man in a dark coat, a real, solid, practical coat, with no interest in legend, stood with his umbrella still closed. He was not a ghost, not a messenger, and not currently remarkable at all. He waited for the London train and observed the world with a habit of mild detachment. He noticed far more than he commented upon, and that saved everyone time. At the police station, Inspector Purbright was introduced to the event by Sergeant Pike, who enjoyed the sound of serious developments. "Odd business last night, sir," Pike said, with the hopeful air of someone setting a table for something large. Purbright adjusted his spectacles and waited. Poetry night. Woman said something about voices. Storm came down. People upset in a respectful way. "Oh," said Purbright. said Purbright. He considered this the correct response. He did not ask questions immediately. He thought about the biscuit he had abandoned the night before, and whether unfinished matters acquired more menace simply by being left. He walked later that morning. He always walked through the square when the town was thinking loudly. The cobbles held puddles that reflected worried faces and the faint embarrassment of respectable buildings. He passed Mrs. Delaney's window and received a look that attempted covert observation and betrayed itself. He passed Polly Went, who smiled in a way that asked permission to unload information at a later date. He passed the town hall, whose doors were closed but whose memory was not. He noticed, without appearing to notice, that one of the potted ferns from the stage had been placed outside, leaning slightly, its pot freshly cracked as though it had been moved in haste. Further away, near the old Draper's Lane, a different kind of silence lived. A shuttered shop sat with its windows blinded by wooden boards. The awning hung crookedly, still wet, still heavy. Beneath that awning, faint marks in the dirt showed where someone had waited without moving their feet very much. The rain had washed them nearly clean. Nearly, but not entirely. By midday, Flaxmere had become certain of its uncertainty. It did not know what had happened, but was deeply sure it had been significant. Friend spoke to friend across slices of bread. Strangers nodded meaningfully. Curtains twitched like small, anxious hearts. Miss Plume, from her narrow kitchen, looked out at the grey street and felt the town beginning to arrange itself around her words. This gave her neither pride nor comfort, only a slightly tightened mouth and the careful folding of the same piece of paper she had not yet destroyed. Somewhere, a voice she had heard in the rain seemed very close again, and somewhere else Inspector Purbright began very gently to suspect that the sentence which had outrun the storm had not simply been about memory. It might, in fact, have been about intent. Inspector Purbright chose the library first. It was not a dramatic decision. It was not intuitive. It was simply that libraries, unlike people, arranged their secrets with a degree of visible shame. Miss Carrow, the librarian, greeted him with the smile of a woman accustomed to whispers that had no intention of staying quiet. "Inspector," she said softly, as though the shelves might object to a louder greeting. "Wonder," Purbright replied, removing his hat with an air of mild apology, "if you attended the poetry evening." "I did," she said, and then after a moment of correction, "I was present, yes." Her fingers arranged a stack of returned books that had not asked to be reordered. "You heard Miss Plume?" he asked. "I heard her voice," Miss Carrow replied, then frowned slightly, as if this distinction troubled her. "I did not hear her meaning. That seemed to be obstructed by the weather." "I'll buy something," she said, and for a moment looked at the window, as though Rain might still be standing there, listening. She lowered her voice unnecessarily. She was frightened, she added, then immediately resented having said so. Purbright nodded as though she had merely commented on the carpet. From the library he walked to the town council office, where Mr. Braithwaite sat with a cup of tea in the careful position of someone preparing to be sensible. "Inspector," Mr. Braithwaite said brightly, "a beastly business." Quite unsettling for a cultural initiative, Purbright observed the man's hands. They hovered near the cup, but did not touch it. "You were close to the stage," Purbright said. "I was near enough to be supportive," Mr. Braithwaite replied, then hesitated. "But far enough to be blameless." "Did you notice anything unusual?" Purbright asked. "Beyond the weather behaving like an anarchist?" Mr. Braithwaite offered a small laugh that died almost immediately. There was a noise. Yes, not rain, not chair, not rain, not chair, not program, something else. Where from? At the back. "Or the idea of the back," he said weakly. "I didn't look. It felt wiser not to." Purbright allowed this to be true. At the railway buffet he found a different manner of silence. Mr. Jebson, the porter, had strong hands and a weak relationship with privacy. "She looked like someone who'd seen something she shouldn't," Jebson said, without being asked. "When?" Purbright inquired mildly. "Not that night. Before. You get that look after Time's had a proper go at you." A cup clinked against a saucer with philosophical uncertainty. "Anyone particularly interested in her?" Purbright asked. Jebson scratched thoughtfully at his chin. "There was someone in a dark coat, waiting without really waiting." Purbright absorbed this. "How does one do that?" he asked. "You look like you've got nowhere to go, but you're very clear about where you are," Jebson explained, with the confidence of a man describing weather. By afternoon, Purbright had allowed 3 more people to talk far more than they intended. Mrs. Dell at the haberdashery, who was certain Miss Plume had notions. Young Marjorie from the council office, who believed there'd been trouble before, but not polite trouble. And Reverend Sims, who confessed with mild irritation that too much listening breeds imagination. Through all of it, he asked questions that were light, courteous, and apparently harmless. Did you feel surprised? Did the room seem smaller? Was the ceiling attentive? People answered generously. They thought they were filling silences. In fact, they were filling patterns. By late afternoon, he walked past the town hall again. The air still smelt faintly of damp fern and quiet embarrassment. The cracked pot sat outside the door, as though placed there by someone who had not wanted to be seen placing it there. The soil was disturbed, but carefully, as if fingers had shaken slightly. He crouched, which he did with a dignity practiced in private. Something small lay caught at the rim of the break, a strand of dark thread, coat thread perhaps, umbrella thread possibly. Threads were rarely dramatic. They were simply loyal to earlier moments. Rain clouds had retreated to a respectable distance. The town was drying with a faint, brittle sound. From a window across the square, curtains shifted twice in quick, frightened motions, like someone who had leaned forward too quickly and then remembered themselves. She merely tightened her hands around the small packet of bread. Inspector Purbright walked again. He walked past the towpath house and noticed that Mr. Pike's gate, though old, was carefully oiled. A man may be rough in presentation and precise in habit. He walked past the town hall and observed that the cracked plant pot had been removed. In its place sat an undamaged pot of the same fern, as if repair were a matter of image rather than fact. He walked down the quieter street where the shuttered shops stood. The awning still hung badly, its fabric holding tiny beads of water as though reluctant to forget the rain. The faint marks in the dirt were gone now. The town had washed them away with feet, brooms, and the steady comfort of distraction. At the police station, Sergeant Pike had adopted a tone. "This seems clear enough, sir," he said, tapping the desk with a pencil that was less patient than it looked. Gerald Pike, always out of step, always about when things go wrong. Purbright did not look up at once. "Always convenient," he said finally. He imagined the sound from the back of the hall, fur. He imagined the weight of a metal umbrella. He imagined the way Miss Plume's eyes had lifted, not towards fear, but towards recognition. None of this would trouble the town. It troubled him slightly. In the early evening, the rain returned in modest practice less, too polite to be theatrical. It tapped gently at roofs and trickled along gutters without ceremony. From behind Mrs. Delaney's curtains, a face watched Mr. Pike leave his house, shoulders slightly hunched, hands in pockets that held nothing more dangerous than coins and lint. "He walks like a guilty man," she murmured. He walked like a tired one. In the small kitchen, Miss Plume folded her paper again. The sentence she had not finished hovered in her thoughts, but not the name the town hoped for. She was not thinking of Gerald Pike. At the railway buffet, the man in the dark coat drank weak tea and observed nothing too keenly. He was remembered by no one, which was one of his quieter successes. Inspector Purbright sat at his desk and lifted the broken shard of plant pot he had taken when no one thought to look. It was heavy. It was ugly. It was honest. The town had found itself a man to blame and felt better, which Purbright thought was usually the first sign that something else had gone wrong. The umbrella appeared without ceremony. It leaned quite casually against the iron railings by the town hall, as though it had merely grown tired of being carried and set itself down to think. It was a dark umbrella, sensible, with a curved wooden handle polished to the shine of frequent handling. Rain clung to its fabric in slow, reluctant beads, though the sky had been dry for hours. By 10 o'clock, 3 people had walked past it twice. By 10:15, Mrs. Delaney had drawn her conclusions. "Someone's left it to be picked up," she announced to her fern, which had survived more scandal than it deserved. "That's how these things begin." Polly went and noticed it from across the square. She did not go near it. One did not hurry towards objects that felt as though they had stories. They had stories. Inspector Purbright noticed it because it leaned at an angle that umbrellas do not naturally choose. He approached with the slow care of a man who disliked irritating objects by appearing too eager. He did not touch it at first. He crouched, which again he did with remembered dignity, and looked at the ground around its tip. There were faint scratches in the stone. Not from dragging. Not from kicking, from turning, perhaps. A small rotation. A moment of indecision that had left a mark. He lifted the umbrella. It was heavier than politeness would suggest. Inside the canopy, the lining showed faint, deliberate stitching near one of the ribs. A repair not meant for eyes that knew where to look. The thread was dark, familiar. The key did not open anything immediately, and this irritated the town. Flaxmere preferred objects to behave usefully. A key in particular was supposed to provide either access or explanation. It did neither, and so the unease moved elsewhere. Old matters, given a little rain and a little darkness, began to rise. It was remembered that Miss Plume had once disagreed publicly with Mrs. Cartwright over the fate of a church raffle. It was recalled that Mr. Braithwaite had opposed a housing plan 10 years earlier because it blocked his view of nothing in particular. It was rediscovered that Mr. Gerald Pike had not been invited to a mayoral tea in 1959 and had declined ever since. At the Women's Guild, where embroidery masked much sharper work, threads of conversation tightened. She always thought herself better, murmured one lady, counting stitches. She listens too much, said another, who listened constantly. There was talk of reputations, which are delicate things that thrive best in low light. Inspector Purbright walked carefully through these resurfacing waters. He visited Miss Carrow again. People are remembering things, he observed. They always do when they're frightened, Miss Carrow said. A memory becomes a comfort, even if it's untrue. He watched the way her hands flattened a book that did not need flattening. Miss Plume has been correct before, she added reluctantly. About what? About who tells the truth and who performs it. That evening he walked to the narrow street of the shuttered shop. The awning sagged, dark with dampness and reluctant age. The boards across the windows had swollen slightly, their nails holding with tired loyalty. It was a shop that had been closed too long to be respectable, and too short a time to be forgotten. Further down, a window opened 6 inches. Mrs. Cartwright's face hovered there, like a witness who had not been asked. "Evening, Inspector," she said. Always said that girl would bring trouble, she offered, as though laying down a previously purchased fact. "You refer to Miss Plume?" "Yes, she was always listening behind hymn books," Mrs. Cartwright said indignantly. "Always writing things down that weren't written. Did she offend you?" "She embarrassed me," Mrs. Cartwright replied, which in Flaxmere was far more serious. At the Draper's Arms the tone had altered. What she nearly said, Mr. Hobb explained to a man who did not care. It wasn't about a man, it was about what men do when they're not being watched. Nearby, 2 women discussed the winter. "Funny how it rained that night," one said. "Funny how it rained the night the treasurer left town too," said the other. This was not accurate. It was useful. Inspector Purbright visited Mr. Braithwaite again, who had begun to look like a man living under a carpet he had chosen. "I think," Mr. Braithwaite said, "that perhaps this goes back years." "How far?" Purbright asked. "As far as it needs to," he said, then lowered his voice. "There were things that should not have been filed." "Filed? Accounts, permissions, donations that were believed in but never proved." His hands covered his cup. "I was not responsible," he added, which is always a complicated sentence. The key grew heavier in Purbright's pocket. By afternoon, Flaxmere was remembering with enthusiasm. Old resentments, once put away carefully, were being polished. The post office clerk said, "There was a cabinet once that never quite closed properly." A teacher remarked, "Some people pass examinations and forget everything decent." Miss Plume walked less. When she did, people looked at her with the careful interest usually reserved for cracks in old buildings. She passed the shuttered shop and slowed, though she did not stop. Behind one boarded window, darkness sat obediently. Inside, something old and dry shifted as a bus passed. Inspector Purbright waited until dusk. He walked alone to the shop. The boards were nailed well, but not lovingly. He touched one, and felt the faint vibration of hollow space behind it. A building abandoned too cleanly, always remembered being lived in. He did not force entry. That was not yet polite. Instead, he listened. Through the wood came the small, dull echo of a space that had been emptied badly. The key, he thought, would belong to something built to be forgotten, not something meant to be used. The town, however, was enjoying itself. At supper tables, theories multiplied. "Wasn't just one voice in the rain," said Mrs. Delaney. "It was a lot of voices that shouldn't have been talking," said Mr. Hobb. People don't like it when old things wake up," Polly Went noted, while trimming fringe she did not need. That night the rain returned without drama. It slid down the glass. It softened the roads again. It made reflections of faces that preferred to think themselves kinder than they were. Miss Plume stood at her sink and stared at her reflection, stretched thin by water. The sentence she had not finished pushed forward in her mind. It did not contain Gerald Pike. It did not contain weather. It contained a place, a sound, a name that had not been spoken for years because speaking it was unpleasant. Inspector Purbright sat at his desk and turned the key over in his pocket without looking at it. Old insults, he thought, never died. They simply waited until the weather was right to speak again. The second incident did not arrive dramatically. It arrived politely, which made it more dangerous. Rain fell again in the early hours of morning, not as a storm this time, but as a careful, persistent presence. It threaded itself into gutters, traced the joints of cobbles, and found small, unimportant places that had not been wet in years. By breakfast, the roof of the town hall was leaking. This in itself would not have troubled anyone. The roof had always been ambitious and occasionally wrong. What troubled people was where the water had ended. It came down through a hairline crack in the ceiling of the records room and directly into a locked filing cabinet. The cabinet had belonged to 3 different men over 10 years. It had been unlocked regularly and properly. It had never been trusted. Now, rainwater stained the carpet beneath it in a widening, faintly respectable puddle. Marjorie from the typing pool saw it first. She did not scream. She did not faint. She fetched a cloth, which was the town's usual response to revelation. When Mr. Braithwaite arrived, he stepped around the wet patch with the air of a man avoiding a moral question. "That will need drying," he said. "It's inside," Marjorie said. "Everything is," he replied too quickly. Inspector Purbright was informed at 9:30. He arrived at 10. He did not fuss. He did not hurry. He examined the slow drip, the discolored ceiling, and then the cabinet itself. The lock had been disturbed, not forced, disturbed. A small, delicate scratch marked one side of the keyhole. A recent touch, familiar metal. He withdrew the key from his pocket and did not show it. Inside the cabinet, folders had shifted, only slightly, as though someone had pushed them apart, looked and then felt obliged to put them back in an order they did not know. One file had swollen where the rainwater reached it. Its edges were soft, its string loosened. Written on the tab in ink grown old and suspicious was the word discretion. Purbright lifted it with care and set it upon the table. Not everything was readable. Enough was names, dates, small sums of money that were not large enough to be crimes, but too awkward to be honest. A signature, Braithwaite. Below it, faded, but undeniably present, Plume, Agatha Plume. Outside the town hall, people had gathered. They did not know why. They rarely did. They felt something had happened, and that was sufficient. Mrs. Delaney lingered under her umbrella, which had no secret pocket. "The roof's gone," she told Mrs. Cartwright. Roofs don't just go," Mrs. Cartwright replied. "They helped. At the Draper's Arms." Mr. Hobb leaned closer to his glass. "Water knows where to go," he said with a confidence he could not have explained. Miss Plume felt it before she heard it. The way towns do, the air growing careful, footsteps taking on a social weight, curtains twitching with new purpose. She stood at her sink, the tea forgotten, and pressed her palm flat against the cold surface. Inside her chest, something old tightened. At the police station, Sergeant Pike asserted himself. "It looks like someone's tampered with it, sir." "Yes," Purbright said. They moved carefully, like people crossing a floor that might creak. She knew now that her name had been in the files. She had known before it was confirmed. Surprises in her life had tended to be more about timing than content. She thought of the winter. Of the night rain had soaked through her coat and down the back of her collar, of the voice that had not matched the wind. She had known the voice. What she had not known was how long it would take to make the world listen. Across town, Mr. Braithwaite did not sit easily. He had done that thing that men like him often did when they feared their own furniture. He poured a drink and did not taste it. Objects around him were in good order, but he felt watched by the walls, which seemed an unreasonable betrayal. His thoughts were loud and badly arranged. He thought of papers signed without reading, of meetings attended because absence would have looked wrong, of sums that were never large but never explained either. He told himself that nothing truly shameful had happened, and the thought was so carefully rehearsed that it sounded false even to him. Buys it. In the streets, Mr. Gerald Pike walked without destination. This had been his habit for many years, but now it felt different. He had always been the man with edges too sharp for polite rooms. Now he felt blunted by other people's fear. He passed the shuttered shop again and saw the swelling in the wood, the dark stain creeping from beneath the door. He felt an odd, misplaced feeling of sympathy for the building. It had been shut not because it was useless, but because it was inconvenient. At the railway buffet, the man in the dark coat finished his tea and stared at the reflection of the ceiling in the surface of the cup. He thought of trains he had not taken and letters he had not sent. His thoughts were tidy, well-trained, and almost entirely dishonest. He preferred it that way. Back in the station, Purbright picked up the newer key. It was lighter, more confident. It had been made by someone who had known exactly what it needed to do. It had not been adjusted nervously. It had not been tried in many locks. It had been created for one purpose and held to it. He thought of cabinets and of rooms that did not appear on public plans. He thought of how water had found the weakness in the ceiling and how gently it had behaved, as if unwilling to be blamed for revealing truths. He allowed himself a small, private amusement. In his experience, buildings were far more honest than people. They could not help but show where they were weakest. Miss Plume rose and crossed the small space of her kitchen. She touched the edge of the table and felt the faint indentation where a cup had rested every morning for years. She imagined the cabinet, the files, the careful loops of string. She did not feel anger. She felt a kind of tiredness that had been ripening since the winter of the voice. She thought of the sentence she had almost finished. It now seemed absurdly small for what it had contained. Outside, curtains shifted as the town prepared itself for sleep. Faces hovered briefly, then withdrew. Flaxmere disliked the darkness, but it disliked its own thoughts even more. Purbright leaned back and placed both keys in the same small tray. He did not feel triumph. He did not feel triumph. He did not feel urgency. He felt only the steady conviction that people were always more predictable in private than they were in public. Rain whispered again at the window, as if practicing a conversation it meant to have later. In several quiet rooms across the town, people stared at walls, cups, floors, and ceilings, and found that their thoughts were no longer obedient. And Inspector Purbright, alone with the sound of the clock and the quiet confidence of lamplight, allowed himself to believe that the truth was beginning, very slowly, to feel uncomfortable. The tea was served at 3. This was important, because in Flaxmere 3 o'clock tea carried a significance that bordered on ceremonial immunity. One did not accuse a person of anything at 3 o'clock. One did not disgrace a drawing room. One did not shout while China was in attendance. Inspector Purbright had chosen the time with care. The setting was the small parlour of the town council office, a room arranged for civility rather than truth. Lace curtains softened the light. A small fire behaved modestly. The table was already set, as though anticipating not conflict, but reassurance. Mr. Braithwaite arrived first, smoothing his cuffs as if they were capable of smoothing his thoughts. Miss Plume came next, moving carefully, as though the carpet might betray her if provoked. Gerald Pike was invited, though his presence unsettled the armchairs. Finally, the man in the dark coat appeared without announcement and was therefore resented without question. Purbright poured the tea himself. It was a small, deliberate discourtesy. "Thank you all for coming," he said, placing the pot down gently. "I thought it might be useful." "Useful?" Mr. Braithwaite repeated. "Comforting," Purbright corrected. The kettle's warmth spread into the cups. The room filled with the faint scent of leaves that had once imagined themselves noble. Biscuits were passed. No one ate. "My question," Purbright said lightly, "is not about the storm. There was, in such gatherings, always a silence that felt like politeness and was actually fear. No?" Mr. Braithwaite attempted a smile that remained unfinished. "No," Purbright said. "My question is about the cabinet." Miss Plume's fingers tightened around her cup, though she did not lift it. The man in the dark coat leaned back slightly, the way one does when a chair begins to lose its patience. Gerald Pike looked from face to face as though searching for the version of the story in which he belonged. Mr. Braithwaite laughed briefly. "A rather damp cabinet, I understand. Yes, an unfortunate leak. Yes, buildings are terribly unreliable creatures." "More reliable than people," Purbright said. He smiled gently. This unsettled them far more than accusation would have done. "I wonder," he said, as though continuing a separate thought, "if any of you recall who had access to the cabinet when it was newer?" Braithwaite's hand hovered above the saucer. "It was always informal." "In what sense?" Purbright asked. "In the sense that it was locked," Braithwaite said, and then too quickly, "but not unkindly. Miss Plume looked at the fire. Gerald Pike stared at the biscuits as though they had disappointed him before. The man in the coat folded his hands, which were very quiet hands. "That depends," said Purbright, "on what one considers serious." He lifted a biscuit and examined it. "Does anyone object to the word discretion?" he asked, as though inquiring about preference in furniture. Miss Plume's cup rattled slightly against the saucer. "I do not," Braithwaite said. "We do," said the man in the coat, and then quickly smiled as if humour had escaped him by accident. Purbright set the biscuit down. "The wrong question," he said pleasantly, "is always the most useful." They did not know what he meant, which annoyed them in different ways. "I had been considering," he continued, "whether the umbrella belonged to Mr. Pike." Mr. Pike stared. "I never owned such a thing," he said. "I know." Braithwaite laughed again wrongly. "An unfortunate prop in an unfortunate set of circumstances." "Ha, yes," Purbright said. "That was the wrong question." Silence. I asked myself whether the rain was theatrical. The man in the coat shifted. Whether the storm was a symbol. Another shift. Whether the words Miss Plume had spoken were truly dangerous. Miss Plume looked at him, and for a brief moment understood. "My mistake," Purbright said carefully, "was that I wondered about the noise at the back of the hall." No one breathed. "That was never the threat," he said. He poured himself another cup of tea. It was steady. It did not fear the room. "The real question," he said gently, "was this. Who had reason to believe that if Miss Plume finished her sentence, certain locked things would no longer be considered safe?" Mr. Braithwaite's hand closed around his cup too tightly. The man in the coat looked at the floor and found it suddenly very interesting. Gerald Pike remained confused but useful. Miss Plume did not move. "I am not accusing anyone," Purbright added, and meant it in the technical sense. "I am not suggesting crimes." The sound of the fire shifted. "I am merely asking the wrong question." The man in the dark coat spoke first. "This is absurd," he said. "Yes," Purbright replied. "It must appear so." He allowed a moment to settle, like dust in late afternoon. Perhaps, he added, smiling very slightly, "we should take tea again another day." They did not answer. When the meeting ended, nothing had been said aloud that could be used again, but something invisible had changed weight. Outside, Flaxmere waited. Curtains trembled. The sky gathered rain that did not yet fall. And in at least two minds in that room, the simple comfort of secrecy began to dissolve, replaced by the rather less comfortable awareness of having been noticed. Purbright walked back to his office alone and tasted his tea halfway down the steps. It was weak, it was honest, and it had done exactly what he needed. The room was brighter than the truth, which seemed only fair. The council chamber had been arranged, as it always was, for mild dignity. Chairs aligned, table polished, windows left slightly ajar for air that never quite arrived. It was late afternoon, and the light rested gently on the backs of chairs, forgiving their age. They had come because they had been asked politely. Politeness in Flaxmere carried an authority that resisted analysis. Mr. Braithwaite sat with his hands folded in a way that suggested cooperation, but practiced distance. The man in the dark coat chose a chair near the wall, as though he might be absorbed into its patterning if required. Gerald Pike remained near the door, not from guilt, but from long habit. Miss Plume sat very still. Inspector Purbright stood. He did not raise his voice. He did not use the room for theatre. He spoke as one does in churches that have lost their congregation, but not their memory. He said that Miss Plume's sentence was never about a voice in the rain. He paused and allowed no one the comfort of interruption. "I believe it was about a room." The man in the coat's foot moved slightly against the leg of his chair. "There was a place in this town," Purbright went on, "that did not appear on maps. It was not a criminal place. It was a convenient one." Mr. Braithwaite's eyes fixed on a knot in the table that had not previously been compelling. "This room," Purbright said, "held documents that were meant to protect reputations rather than records. A silence formed that was no longer respectful. It was frightened." "In cold weather," he added, "certain pipes were known to make sympathetic noises behind the walls of that room." Miss Plume closed her eyes. "She heard those noises one night," Purbright said. "She was outside. The rain covered her presence." He turned slightly toward her, but not too obviously. "She heard a voice inside." No one doubted it now. She recognized it. The man in the dark coat adjusted his collar. That voice did not belong to a man like Mr. Pike, Purbright continued. It belonged to a man who understood the value of a quiet second drawer. Mr. Pike did not react. He was too accustomed to being invisible. This man, Purbright said softly, arranged for a key to be made when the original was mislaid. He placed the old key on the table, then the new one. No one touched them. The newer key was not for the cabinet, Purbright said. It was for a room. Heads turned towards the shuttered shop without being able to see it. In that shop, he went on, there is a back room. It was once part of a solicitor's overflow. Papers stored temporarily. Forgotten officially, remembered privately. Mr. Braithwaite inhaled and failed to make a sound. The rain revealed the cabinet, Purbright said. The umbrella revealed the key. The leak revealed the file. And Miss Plume revealed nothing, because her sentence was never allowed to live. He looked at the man in the coat. You were unfortunate, he said gently. You continued a habit that should have ended. I did not steal, the man said quickly. No, Purbright agreed. You tidied. That word fell with unexpected weight. You moved things that were becoming visible, Purbright said. You tested locks that should not have been tested. And when you realized Miss Plume had heard, you attempted to frighten her with sound, not harm. The man swallowed. I knocked a chair, he said. Yes. You dropped a book, Purbright said. Yes. You let the storm finish the work. No one spoke. Mr. Braithwaite's face had lost its colour. You were not brave men, Purbright said. You were not wicked men. You were tidy men. Gerald Pike shifted. And you, Purbright said kindly, were useful because you did not fit in a chair that people liked. Pike nodded, awkwardly moved. Miss Plume borrowed his courage. As she tried to tell us, she said quietly, surprising herself most of all. You did, Purbright said. Silence settled. The kind that ends things. I will not make a case, Purbright said, which was the sort of sentence that caused the room to lean forward without intending to. They looked at him. I will make a report, he continued, and a lock will be removed. He gathered the keys and closed his hand around them. The sentence, he said, it was this. Some rooms do not keep secrets. They only delay their voices. The man in the coat closed his eyes. Mr. Braithwaite did not. Miss Plume felt a strange and unfamiliar relief. Outside, the first drop of the evening rain struck the glass. Not dramatic, not symbolic, simply accurate. The truth, having been fully heard, did not change the town. It merely made it adjust its furniture. Flaxmere returned to itself slowly, which was the only way it knew how. The rain ceased without ceremony. Not with any apology, not with a brightening sky, but by simply feeling it had said enough. The gutters resumed their ordinary, dishonest trickle. Puddles shrank back into the cobbles as though embarrassed by their own ambition. By the next morning, the town had agreed not to talk about the council chamber. This agreement was not made aloud. It was understood in glances, in the careful buttering of toast, in the way people paused slightly before saying too much, and then said nothing at all. At Mrs. Delaney's window, the lace curtains twitched with a gentler rhythm. They've sorted it, she informed the street, though she did not know what X now was. These things always get sorted. At the Draper's Arms, Mr. Hobb adopted a tone of reflective satisfaction. I can't go digging about in old matters, he declared, although he had done little else for days. Upsets the balance. Balance, in Flaxmere, was achieved by careful forgetting. Miss Plume walked more freely now. She did not feel triumphant. She did not feel brave. She felt instead a quiet loosening, as though a knot she had been carrying had found a reason to rest. She passed the shuttered shop and saw that the boards had been removed. The windows were bare, the interior dim, but no longer secret. No one had gone inside yet. The town preferred its discoveries at a leering distance. She touched the glass lightly, and for the first time in many months did not imagine the sound of pipes. Mr. Gerald Pike was no longer avoided in quite the same way. The butcher nodded at him without articles of suspicion. The post office clerk returned his greeting without wincing. Children, who adapted more quickly than their parents, ceased to stare at him as though he were a moving rumour. He walked past the towpath with his hands in his pockets and felt not relief, but a kind of weary dignity returning to its proper place. In the council offices, a small, deliberate reordering occurred. Mr. Braithwaite began to file things that had not been filed. He spoke less and listened more, which troubled him but improved the atmosphere. The cabinet was emptied. The word "at discretion" did not appear again, which was regarded as progress. The man in the dark coat had left. He did not announce his departure. He simply ceased to be available. His cup was no longer remembered at the railway buffet. His reflection no longer troubled the thin china. In the police station, Inspector Purbright resumed his paperwork. The keys lay now in an evidence tray, where they looked less purposeful and more honest. Sergeant Pike asked once whether a charge might be made. Purbright looked at him for a moment that allowed the question to age properly. "I think," he said, "the town has been charged enough." "That's not usual," Pike said. "No," Purbright replied. He wrote slowly. Not because he was tired, but because he appreciated words when they behaved. Outside, the market continued, a stall appeared selling apples that were suspiciously shiny. A woman argued with a weighing scale that had developed opinions. A dog barked at nothing of consequence. Life in Flaxmere resumed its small, determined routines. Mrs. Delaney moved her fern back to the front of the window. Polly Went told the story carefully, now improved by pity rather than excitement. She was very quiet about it all, she said, trimming hair that did not require trimming. A brave in her own way. Miss Plume returned to the library. She sat at a table and wrote nothing. She did not need to. The sentence she had once carried like a fragile object now belonged properly to the air. In the late afternoon, the sky gathered itself again, but this time without omen. The rain arrived softly, worked briefly, and left. Purbright, finishing his last form, paused. He considered the biscuit that had stayed uneaten from days before and decided not to punish it further. He rose, put on his coat, and stepped outside. The town looked at him and did not look away. He walked through the square. He passed the town hall, whose roof had been mended too brightly. He passed the shuttered shop, now only a shop again. He passed the iron railings where the umbrella had leaned and left no mark that anyone could see. He paused once, feeling the calm settle, and thought of Miss Plume's voice and how little the storm had mattered. He returned to his office and switched off the lamp. The clock ticked. The walls did not listen. The town breathed, differently perhaps, but steadily. And in the quiet, uncelebrated certainty of his paperwork, Inspector Purbright allowed himself to think, without drama, that sometimes a sentence was never meant to be finished aloud. It was meant simply to be heard at last.